Australia is going through a housing crisis. As with any other crisis, there are people who suffer, the people who are blamed and scapegoated, and the people who perpetrate it. And one of those perpetrators is the Rhodesian boss himself, Scott Challen.
Every time I see them, I go ka-ching, ka-ching. I want to take a minute to share with you why I identify as a cooker. Real fucking mess here.
If you've been on TikTok at all, you may know this guy called Shallow Cal. He makes videos about building and construction, specifically on how housing is in this country, which sounds great. I mean, you know, housing's pretty...
But none of them are talking about migration, which is actually the real fucking root cause of the problems in Australia.
Now look, on this channel we've talked a lot about how people who benefit or perpetrate housing problems in this country often try to find scapegoats or other things to distract you from the fact that they might hold some responsibility. Of course, there's Hugo Lennon constantly targeting or scapegoating immigrants, despite not only being a multi-millionaire trust fund baby, but being a multi-millionaire trust fund baby of his grandfather's property empire, which made hundreds of millions from selling houses at higher and higher prices, making them more and more expensive for the rest of us. Or there's Leith Van Onselen, who's dedicated most of his website for like the last 12 years towards blaming immigrants for our housing problems, but who is a fund manager who literally puts money into corporations financing and fueling investment demand into the housing market, which artificially bids prices up for the rest of us. And unfortunately, Shallow Chal, or Scott here, is very similar. Very quickly, because I know I'll get complaints despite arduously covering it all the time, immigration has not caused the housing crisis in Australia. The housing crisis is basically how homes are becoming increasingly out of reach for younger, less wealthy people due to high increases in prices. It's gotten to the point that even a decline in house prices wouldn't really do much. Since 2016, Australia has built nearly 1.6 million dwellings, and in the same time frame, total households, which both includes domestic growth and immigration, has risen by 1.47 million. This means that we have an excess supply of housing, but there are more caveats we can add. 20% of these households own more than one property, many of which hold empty properties. In Metro Melbourne alone, there are 100,000 empty properties, or a vacancy rate of 4.85%. If we extrapolate that to Australia broadly, we get over 500,000 empty properties across the country. Likewise, Melbourne in 2019 had a commercial vacancy rate of 10.9%, which across Australia adds up to 130,000 properties. So while, yeah, it's a very rough calculation, no matter how you put it, we've built way more homes to accommodate the amount of people coming in, which means this isn't necessarily a scarcity problem, but more a distribution problem. The system isn't distributing homes to people who need it. We've got the resources, we've got the ability to house everyone and more in this country, yet we can't. If you're curious, the fact that the housing crisis in this country is not caused by immigration is something reaffirmed by the academic literature. While, like many things, there is an impact on price growth by incoming immigrants, the impact is not nearly large as many would suggest, such as our mate Scott here. Scott is the CEO of QHI Group, a company in the home improvement sector. He, despite what the relevant investigation, inquiry, and raw numbers say about immigration and housing, believes that the root cause of Australia's housing crisis is, of course, those bloody immigrants.
But none of them are talking about migration, which is actually the real fucking root cause of the problems in Australia. You are not going to solve the housing crisis and maintain high migration. You can't have both. It doesn't work that way.
Now, it's very convenient for him to use probably the most scapegoated demographic in human history as a way to distract from the fact that he actually wants house prices to grow.
Our deck and pool roof pavilions are on our website. They go really well. They'll add massive value to your home.
Yeah, in spite of all the rhetoric about immigration and house prices, Scott was lamenting on live radio after home prices fell slightly in Victoria.
The number one asset most any of us ever have is a house.
I was thinking about this. Imagine, you just scrimped and saved. You're in your 30s. You've just paid off your HECS debt. You've finally got your house deposit together. You've bought your first house. Might be a fibro and weatherboard house that was built in the 50s or 60s. And then suddenly this thing rolls out and you find out that your house has gone back in value. You might have negative equity in your home for that moment. That's scary.
Usually the anti-immigrant crowd isn't this explicit, but yeah, they're happy to scrimp and save their antagonism for the most easy to target people, immigrants. But all of a sudden when land taxes cause a slight drop in price growth, which by the way has allowed for more people to become owner-occupiers as opposed to renters,
that's scary.
Now, I actually agree that a significant drop in home prices without doing anything else is really bad, and I've gone over it many times, but Scott here has advocated for prices to fall in his anti-immigrant videos.
New Zealand, with a change of government, cuts their migration to virtually fucking nothing. In fact, they're at a negative migration rate in New Zealand at the moment, and their house prices are coming down and correcting themselves, as are their rental stocks and all of the costs involved in building. The market is correcting itself by reducing the demand.
Yet all of a sudden, when the government actually does something to curtail price growth, it's a big problem.
That's scary.
I've got a video addressing that claim about New Zealand, by the way, but clearly he only cares about price growth insofar as he can justify his anti-immigration stance, because when policies that promote owner occupation and price falls are implemented, he hates it. But this isn't the only contradiction in Scott Challen. Googling his name, you'll find numerous Daily Mail and Yahoo articles where he's complaining about the work culture of Gen Z, the least boomer you could think of.
Under Labour, I can't abuse my 17-year-old underpaid apprentice. It won't be easy under Albanese.
He even has a podcast where he complains about it.
Yep. In 1997, I'm working on a building project in West Africa, and I'm going back in time here, kids, so bear with me while I recount the good old days. We're a building project in West Africa, 3 hours from the nearest hospital by road. I had vultures circling over my head every day waiting to pick my eyeballs out as soon as I fell off that roof, and no scaffold 14 metres in the air, and there wasn't even a toilet on site. So when I had to go to the toilet, I had to run into the jungle with a handful of rags.
Yeah.
Would that be considered safe?
Possibly not.
Possibly not, but the reality is we've all evolved and grown from a place where things weren't always safe. We did our best with what we had.
Yeah.
And have we gone too far? Have we
Yeah.
gone over the top? I don't believe that anyone should take unnecessary risk. But if there's one thing that we've seen come out of the last 3 or 4 years, it's this complete adversity to risk. No one wants to take any chances. And it seems like safety is everything now.
So to show that Gen Z is completely risk averse, you uncritically brag about the fact that you apparently worked in West Africa with vultures circling around you next to a jungle, and then you ask, are we going too far with health and safety? Kind of tells on himself when he says the only reason he allegedly prioritizes safety on his sites is because he'll go to jail if it happens.
If somebody dies on one of my building sites, I'm going to go to jail.
Now, if you think there's nothing wrong with that, imagine someone said that the only reason they're not a murderer or a rapist is because it's illegal. It's not the best way to show how good of a person you are, I'll just say that. But regardless, there is one thing that Scott talks about that has validity: the declining rate of profit we've seen in the building industry.
Yeah, sorry about my profit margins. What profit? What if I can find me a builder in the country that's made me profit in the last 18 months? Yeah, now I don't.
3,000 building companies have gone broke in the last year. Now, put very simply, things are made and distributed in the economy by mainly private companies that prioritize turning over a profit for its owners. This means that they are motivated to make as much profit as they can, part of which is minimizing the cost of inputs like wages, land, capital, etc. Wages are, famously, paid to actual people, and these people, typically, like the owners, want to make as much money as possible in the best conditions. This naturally costs the business owners more, who are already wanting to minimize costs as much as they can. So at the heart of our system, you've got a conflict or a contradiction where workers and owners push and pull to try and get the most money out of each other. It's the reason why workers formed unions to begin with, so that they have more bargaining power when negotiating their pay. Alongside other excesses of our economic system, whether it be expansionist wars, oversupply, or environmental degradation, this tussle can cause profit to fall, meaning businesses collapse, which is exactly what Scott is talking about in the building sector. Only Scott is a part of that owning class. He loves to portray himself as an everyman fighting the elite, but in reality, he's just a different section of that elite. He's a part of the owner class. He clearly doesn't care about openly contradicting himself about housing or complaining about safety standards, and the only time he advocates for wage increases is when he can get the government to subsidize it. But of course, this isn't it. No, Scott is a wacky guy. See, he
Couldn't give a fuck about the Middle East. Palestine, Israel, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Couldn't give a fuck. Turn the whole joint in the glass. I wouldn't lose a second of sleep over it.
But he does have time out of his day to rep the Rhodesian flag. For those unaware, Rhodesia was a country ruled over now Zimbabwe, and it was essentially a white ethno-state. There was a war fought basically because Rhodesia was treating its black inhabitants so poorly. The Rhodesian boss himself is honouring his family's legacy, a legacy of justifying discrimination against disenfranchised demographics to cover up for his own f***ed up shit. Who would have thought that the Rhodesian boss would use immigration to distract from the fact that he and his class's profit-seeking are the reason why we're in a housing crisis to begin with, a crisis that they can get rich from that we ultimately suffer from.